Okay. All right. Well, I think now is a good time to start. So thank you all for coming. We have a couple of great panelists here today. We have Ryan and Hillary, and myself, Nicole. We'll all introduce ourselves before getting started, and then we'll talk a little bit more about, different majors that you can choose in undergrad, different extracurriculars, and hopefully a lot of helpful stuff. Today is really for you guys. So if you have any specific questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or the Q&A section at the bottom is apparently an anonymous way to submit questions. So feel free to use that feature on Zoom as well. But yeah, we can go ahead and introduce ourselves. So I guess I'll start. My name's Nicole. I'm a third year medical student at DGSOM. I majored in biochem in undergrad at Wake Forest University. And I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. Ryan or Hillary, you can start.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Hillary. I'm a current MS2 at DGSOM. I majored in neuroscience at Yale University, and I'm from Orange County, California.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan. I am, I guess, PhD 4 in the MD PhD program. So that would be 6 years out of an 8-year program, maybe 9, depending on how long the PhD goes. But I majored, actually double majored in electrical engineering and bioengineering at UC Berkeley. So a bit of a very different anti-life science starting point. Yeah.
All right, awesome. So, the first thing that we can kind of talk about is choosing a major in undergrad. I know a lot of people submitted questions about this, such as, is it okay to choose a non-STEM major? And we're wondering what our majors were in undergrad, and just like advice in general on how to choose a major. So, I guess I can give my 2 cents first, and then I'll kind of shoot this question over to the other panelists. My major personally was biochemistry, which I think is a pretty, common major. Lots of science majors apply into medical school. Although when I was applying to medical school, I did a lot of research on, different majors, of different applicants. And it turns out that a lot of people actually have non-traditional majors. So, for instance, like a Spanish major or an English major or a history major. There's no reason to actually choose a science major, as long as you still get your pre-med classes done for medical school. So as long as you complete those pre-med prerequisites needed for medical school, you don't actually need to have a science major. And some people online even were saying, it may give you a little bit of a boost to like have a different major, other than a science major. So that's my 2 cents. I do think having a biochemistry major was helpful in, getting that science background. It made it a little bit easier when studying for the MCAT, studying for sections like biology and chemistry, obviously. But I don't think it made any easier to study for like the CARS reading section on the MCAT, or what was the other one? The psych section. That's all just memorization. So I'll hand it over to maybe Ryan if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah, I think generally there isn't a hard and fast rule for what majors are acceptable. In fact, any and all majors are kind of in the purview for being a pre-med. It's more so what you do with it, how you integrate it into your story, and then, of course, as Nicole mentioned, making sure that you check off all those boxes for your pre-med classes. But I knew people that were coming in from the humanities, all walks of the humanities. I knew people who were coming in from like sort of like econ or poli-sci majors. I knew people who were coming in from like the very stereotypical science majors, all walks of those, biochem, etc. So you really can start anywhere, I think. as long as it's meaningful to your path and you can explain it well. Like usually when you are in your interview or application essay writing phase, people want to know kind of about you, your story, and the major is of course going to be a pretty integral part of that for you. So as long as it kind of merges or converges on your narrative, I think that's probably the most important thing. And of course, your personal interest in it. That should be first and foremost.
Yeah, so I agree with both Ryan and Nicole. You don't need to be a STEM major to be a successful applicant for medical school. Personally, I chose neuroscience because I've always had an interest in it. And there were also like a lot of students in my cohort who were also neuro majors and pre-med. But I also had a lot of friends who were like history or English and engineering majors who were also on the pre-med track. And they also had really good outcomes. So I think overall, it's not as important like what major you choose to be pre-med. It's matters more if you are able to like fulfill your pre-med requirements and if you're able to engage in other activities like research or clinical volunteering.
Yeah, thanks,
Like,
guys. I totally agree with that. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
sorry, yeah, I was just gonna add on a couple notes. So I actually came into Berkeley engineering undeclared. So I hadn't decided out front what particular major I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to do something in engineering because I liked working with my hands, building stuff. And it was kind of a niche major. Like Berkeley doesn't admit a lot of people in the engineering undeclared category because you kind of get your pick of the litter, if you will. Um, but I kept actually flip-flopping. Like if you talk to the advisor who was maybe unlucky enough to be overseeing my education there, on one week I'd be saying, I want to do EE. The other week I'd say I want to do bio. The other week I'd say, maybe I should switch entirely to MCDB or something like that. So I think if you are facing those questions on like you're torn between different disciplines, I guess first thing I'd say is you can always double. It is of course more work and very challenging, but you can always kind of like spread that interest. And of course you can always try to like fit them into each other. So if you don't want to double, you can choose one and then find ways to link them together and maybe either your own research or your personal endeavors, your volunteering, your outreach efforts, etc. So it's very possible to merge things that on the superficial side might look kind of like entirely disparate, like can't even combine them, but you can actually do some pretty amazing things there. And that is, I think, when Nicole was asking about the sort of like it being sort of like a standout aspect of your application or who you are, those are the things that people can quite frankly, easily remember sometimes. So, yeah. Follow your passions though.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That brings up something else for me too. I'd say if you have like a couple passions, like Ryan is talking about, trying to integrate them into your story and trying to, get involved in extracurriculars that emphasize those passions, because that really does make you stand out on applications. But also just in line with majors, you can think about minors as well. So I minored in entrepreneurship just because I thought business was really interesting. And a lot of people in the science field don't have a lot of knowledge in business. So I kind of wanted to just like have a little bit more knowledge. And a lot of people asked me about my entrepreneurship minor. On my interview days because I think it was a unique thing, and it really stood out to them. And I kind of used that minor to help me in the development of a nonprofit later, which was another thing that I felt stood out on my application. So again, just like using your majors and minors and trying to combine that into your story, and also into your extracurriculars. All right. So the next thing we can talk about is the MCAT. Prepping for the MCAT, when do you start prepping? Do you start junior year? Do you start senior year? Do you start after college? And I know a couple of people submitted questions that said, were there any particular classes that were helpful, that you felt were helpful in prepping for the MCAT? So again, I can start off. I actually did not start thinking about the MCAT until very late in my undergrad career. Senior year is when I started thinking about it, but I already knew I wanted to take a gap year. So my plan was to just take the one gap year, take the MCAT and apply to medical school. But what ended up actually happening was I took 2 gap years because I wanted to get more involved in the nonprofit um, that I started, and then also just to like give me more time to study for the MCAT because I made the mistake of not studying for it during my undergrad experience. So if I were to go back, I would recommend starting to study, junior year if possible. Senior year is probably more practical, and then taking it. Um, I don't know, actually. I'll let you guys maybe you have more to say on this if you have a more traditional application. But I ended up basically taking 2 gap years. Yeah. All right. I'll let you guys have your shot at that question. Maybe Hillary, you want to start?
I think I started prepping for the MCAT in the beginning of my junior year, and I took it sometimes in the spring semester of my junior year. I mainly used just like for content review, I used the Kaplan prep books for each subject. And I also used a bit of UWorld for practice questions, but I really wish that I used more of it since I started using it near the end of my study period, and didn't really get to go through that many questions, but I found them to be really helpful. And I also recommend doing the AAMC full-length practice tests. I think there are either 4 or 5 of them, and I try to do them um, in like one sitting for each exam in like the 2 months or so leading up to my exam.
I was typing a reply to a question. I'll finish that in a moment. But to talk about my MCAT experience, I took it twice. I can tell you all the things that you should do and all the things that you shouldn't do. What you shouldn't do is start studying full time 2 weeks before your test date. What you should do instead is to start probably at least 3 months in advance. And I would advise taking actually even more time than that. I made like a little deck, I think in first year of PhD or so, that I had presented about like how to succeed on the MCAT with like a small budget. And one of the points was, start early, start like in advance. And so I would really sort of second the thought that has been presented in that you should start maybe like sophomore or junior year. That's not to say that, when you get out of class, you hit the Kaplan books and do nothing but Kaplan books until you sleep and then go to class, do your homework, and all that. But it is worthwhile getting familiar with the test format, getting familiar with the types of questions they ask, because it's a very different test than anything you've ever taken before. So I'd advise that. I would also just on the subject of timelines. So since I think this session was kind of marketed for like deciding on majors slash looking at MCAT and extracurriculars, I gather there might be some students maybe in the first year or two of the undergrad experience. And so I would recommend taking a little bit of a look at the timeline for when you typically need to apply or take MCAT. Based on what your entry date for med school would be. So if you're on a 4-year college timeline and then want to dive directly into med school afterwards, you need to apply actually in the end of your junior year. So for example, early 2024, like May/June 2024, there's the application portal that will open and then people can start submitting their applications. And then now that we're in the fall of 2024, those same people would be interviewing for medical school. And that would be interviewing to then matriculate in the fall of 2025. So you kind of have to think a little bit in advance. And so it's good to time your MCAT accordingly. Especially if you think or anticipate you might want to take it twice. It's generally not recommended to take it more than once, but my logic was the first time wasn't really representative of what I thought was my ability. And so I decided to hit it a little harder, take the due diligence to study it appropriately, and then take it a second time and did much better. So I think there are lots of things to unpack with MCAT, but I think the main takeaways I probably want to emphasize is study early, have a study plan. So talk it over with other people, ideally either med students through like the Med Mentors program or other people who might have experience with the study plan. Be diligent with your study plan, build in breaks, take your practice exams pretty frequently, and then knock it out of the park at the end. So happy to talk more on MCAT though, because there's a lot to say there.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ryan and Hillary as well. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to unpack with the MCAT. I also wanted to echo a few resources that I thought were really good during my time studying for the MCAT. So I thought UWorld was a fantastic resource that I wish I had used more. I also think you should do all of the content put out by the test takers. So there's a lot of like practice tests and practice questions that they put out themselves. Make sure to go through all of that. And then I actually used, I'm going to paste something in the chat. I used Khan Academy YouTube videos for the psych portion of the test, and I thought those were fantastic. In addition to, there's this 90-page psych document you can find on Reddit and a 300-page psych document you can find on Reddit. And if you just review the 300-page document, the 90-page document, and watch these videos, I think you'll be golden for the psych portion of the test. So I feel like that's a really good one to ace really quickly. Alrighty. Okay, so next we'll move on to some extracurriculars. So there's a lot of different extracurriculars that you can do in undergrad. I think some of the most common ones that people bring up is shadowing, research, and volunteering. So shadowing, I would say, is a very important extracurricular and one that you should take, not only to like that you should take pretty seriously, not only to just put on your resume, but to also kind of get an understanding of what the medical field is and to make sure you really truly want to go into the medical field before you apply for medical school. I know everyone says this, it just really is a long, grueling process. So make sure you really want to go into medicine before you apply. And the key to doing that is to really shadow as many doctors as you can in as many different specialties. Um, and then other opportunities that you have as a pre-med are volunteering. So you can get involved in like a local hospital. For instance, one extracurricular that I did was basically working with my local hospital and making like doing arts and crafts in the pediatrics department, which was a lot of fun. And then in terms of getting involved in research, I would say this is becoming more and more of something that pre-meds are almost expected to do on your applications for medical school. Um, so ways to get involved in research would be to kind of think of topics that you're interested in yourself, and then trying to look up professors at UCLA that also share those same interests. So let's say you're interested in cancer or oncology research. You could try to look up any UCLA professors that maybe are in the biology department that have research that's related to oncology. And then I'd recommend just reaching out to them over email, just saying, I'm very interested in your research. Maybe I've read some of your papers on PubMed. And, could I set up a meeting with you to potentially get involved? So that's how I'd recommend going about that. But I will hand the mic over to Hillary next.
Yeah, so just to touch on your first point about shadowing, I feel like for shadowing, it's not so much about like how many hours you shadowed, but it's more about what kind of experience you obtained and whether or not it helped you but it gave you some insight on why you want to go into medicine. So for me, I think I only logged about maybe 50 shadowing hours, which I think is a good amount. I feel like you don't need like 200, 300 hours of shadowing. But I had really good experiences with the physicians that I worked with. And I even wrote about like a specific experience I had in my personal application, in my personal statement. And then for other activities, I try to make a good balance between both my clinical and my non-clinical volunteer experience. So um, for my clinical experience, um, I volunteer at the hospital, and then I also volunteer at like a local doctor's office, sometimes during COVID. And for my non-clinical experience, I um, worked with I participated in like some cultural events in my community, and I also volunteered as a tutor for a couple years. So I think it's also good to have a balance between um, like the clinical and the non-clinical. I think of course like medical schools want to see you do the clinical experience because that also helps or um, determine why you want to go into medicine. But it's also good to have non-clinical as well to like diversify your experience. And then for research, I try to get into research early, but you don't necessarily have to. I think I started sometime in my freshman year, but I have friends who were pre-med who started in like their sophomore year. And some even like started to more actively focus on research during their third year or the summer before their third years. So if you think that, oh, like I haven't started research in my first year, like I'm totally screwed. And that's totally false. You don't need to start research right away. It takes time to find a lab that you're both interested in and um, that supports like student publications. So I know that there are some labs where like the PI and the lab mentors, they are like very supportive of trying to help their students like be co-authors or have their own publications. Um, Meanwhile, there are some other labs that maybe like they're not as focused on that. So I try when searching for labs, I try to um, type in like the lab name and then look at the lab members and see if there like are a lot of undergrad um, researchers or undergrad research assistants. And then I try to look to see if there are any publications that they were co-authors of under that lab to help me determine if, oh, like this lab could be a good opportunity for me to push out publications, or it could also have like a good mentorship team. So that was one of the main factors that helped me choose the lab that I chose.
Thanks, Hillary. Ryan?
Yeah, all fantastic points, I would second. I think a commonality you'll hear in all these responses that everyone might have a slightly different emphasis in terms of where their time went during undergrad and what activities they sort of pursued. So if you are listening to these responses and being like, wow, I hate research. I never want to touch a pipette. I never want to do any sort of like chart review or clinical things like that. That's fine. You can still make it through. If you, on the other hand, love research and don't really want to do a bunch of sort of like more sort of outreach or educational activities or whatnot, you can also do that. So it's not to say that you need to be doing, you know, hundreds of hours of all of these things, but more so that these are kind of the categories that a lot of people will find their time going to in various levels. So that's, I guess, point number one. Point number two would be, I guess, a summary of my experiences. So I guess I can describe my time outside of class went to three things. That was taiko, which is Japanese drumming, research, particularly in the development of swimming micro robots, which I could never actually make swim, and then some shadowing. So, and I guess what I would recommend is where possible, you can try to find ways where where two things might mesh together. And what I mean by that is my shadowing was done at UCSF with a phenomenal MD PhD, Dr. Mikhail Anwar, working in the radiation oncology department. And he also was one of my research mentors. So I did research with him as well as shadowed under him. And what that allowed me to do is actually get a very active role in the shadowing. And I put that in air quotes because I would say it probably was a little more than just shadowing. Like I got to kind of like see how radiation treatment plans were being made, got to actually actively talk through how the plan was made, maybe even try to contribute my own suggestions, despite the fact that I was not like a resident or whatnot. They still allowed me to be included in that conversation. I got to see tumor boards. You know, it was probably one of the most amazing things to see when you have physicians from all walks of life, different specialties, anesthesiology, general surgery, radiation oncology, all these people coming together to talk about one patient at a time, you know, to find a treatment plan to make their life the best it can possibly be. So in that regard, you know, I was able to tie together my research interests in radiation oncology with the clinical interests and the shadowing. Um, Taiko was kind of a little bit more of a one-off. I've done percussion ever since I was 4, just like smacking stuff with sticks, I guess. And it was a nice outlet that was not overtly medically related or actually medically related at all. And I think it's encouraging, or I would encourage all of you, if you have such interest, not to sort of like squash them or put them by the wayside in favor of all clinical things or whatnot, because on the admission side, when they are looking at applicants and whatnot, and they see just all these people who did nothing but like clinical volunteering and hospital volunteering and whatnot, those are all amazing things. You should totally do them. But if that's all there is to your application, they start seeing it as a very unidimensional kind of application. And so if you have these things that are a little bit off the beaten path or whatnot, something that you were genuinely interested, not even related to academics or anything like that, highly recommend pursuing it. In fact, some of my interviews actually were nothing like medically or academic, but it was all on the Japanese drumming or hangpan, which is an instrument that I happened to mention in passing, and it turned out the person I was interviewing with loves them and wanted to know how he could get one. So all that summarizing would be pursue your interests. It's really important to pursue your interests. Undergrad is hard, med school is hard. Follow your interests, and you'll find your way. But you can find creative ways to tie things together too. So
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Well said. One thing I want to add on to that as well is kind of echoing what you said is really pursue those hobbies that you've always had. It also makes you stand out. And a lot of interviewers, like Brian said, want to talk to you about those things because those are the things that make you unique. So I was a dancer and I've been a dancer my entire life since I was two, and I continued to dance throughout undergrad. And I tried to find a way to like tie that into medicine. So I was able to do some dance therapy research, which was not only fun for me, but I got to study, the positive impacts of dance on others. So I think that was a really fun way to tie in my interests and hobbies into medicine. But again, like Ryan said, doesn't have to be tied into medicine. It is good to just have hobbies because people want to know that you're a human that also operates outside of medicine. Let's
Yeah.
see. And then, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah, I agree with that. I also I guess throughout my undergrad, I also continued a lot of like the cultural activities that I um started when I was in middle school or high school. Um, so I grew up in like a really big Viet community in Orange County, and even after moving to the Northeast where there wasn't like that big of a population, I still try to get involved in um like the Viet student organization and like attending um our annual like holidays and celebrations. And even then, I still try to connect back to like my hometown when I'm on breaks or vacation. Like I would uh, volunteer to like help out with mentorship for I think they were elementary school students who are trying to do this like mini quiz bowl style competition. And um, I was also able to still perform a lot, even when I was worried that, oh, like I moved far away, so I can't be involved anymore. But I think if you have like a passion that you're really willing to work for, then it's definitely possible to like find opportunities to keep engaging in whatever interest you're working on.
Thanks, Hillary. All some really good insights. All right. I think I'm going to go through a couple of these questions you guys put in the chat or submitted before the meeting about the extracurriculars. I'll just ask you guys, Hillary and Ryan, what your advice is for them. Okay, so one of them is what are some good non-clinical volunteering opportunities you've participated in or have known about? Hillary, if you want to start that one off. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Um, you said non-clinical volunteering? Okay. So for my non-clinical volunteering, I've always been really interested in like mentoring and like tutoring younger students. So one of my top ones was I used to volunteer for a tutoring center in my hometown. And once I moved away to college, I was still able to teach the students over Zoom since it happened during our COVID period. So that was something that I was able to maintain over like a long period of time. And then I also joined this club where we have volunteers who create like lesson plans on various topics. It doesn't have to be academic related. It can be something like, oh, how to build your own kite, or um, I don't know, like how to make something. So those were for high school and middle school students, and I really enjoyed like being able to like work with my partners and um, sometimes making like little arts and craft projects for the students. Um, Another thing I did was, um, as I mentioned before, I still try to keep in touch with my like cultural community. So whenever I'm back home, like especially during COVID when we were remote, I was able to still participate and volunteer for a lot of the cultural events, whether it was online or in person.
That's awesome. Ryan, do you have any tips to share?
Yeah, I guess so. Going back to the point I made about combining things where possible. So the taiko group I was a part of had some opportunities for volunteering where you could go out to kind of like the local Shinto and Buddhist temples to like teach young kids how to play taiko. So it was a very actually like very fun, rewarding experience. You're going out to the community, kind of engaging with those around you. So if you are part of a group that is again not overtly clinically related or academically inclined like related, then you can certainly kind of find these opportunities to make volunteering a part of it. In terms of finding it, I think it's like it's maybe not the best answer, but it's really just goes back to your interest, right? So if you are find something very enjoyable, you can usually it doesn't take too much thought to find out how you can then apply it to a volunteering situation, whether that's showing other people how to do this thing you're passionate about, whether it's, going out to, be a group and like spread awareness about this thing you're passionate about or whatnot. It's something that I think can be done without too much effort and without too much like budget or anything else behind it. Um, Other non-clinical volunteering I was involved in. Oh, I like so Berkeley had this thing where it was like I forget what the club was named, which is probably like a crime now. But it was essentially like, their whole thing was they would have one massive day of volunteering, and so you would sign up, and then they would kind of assign you to all of these different either like nonprofits or organizations in the area. And I think multiple times I found myself in the Habitat for Humanity kind of bunch, and so we would go out and like help maybe like clear a construction site or whatnot to set up housing for those that are like from a housing standpoint disenfranchised, etc. So I think you can find both personal ways as well as more large group ways to get involved. Just takes a little bit of digging.
Yeah, thanks. And then I guess in terms of my experiences with non-clinical volunteering, I was involved in a club called Thrive at my university, which was a mental health club at our university. And we kind of focused on finding ways to better the mental health of our community. So we would, bring puppies into the library sometimes. We would host like little wellness sessions, like meditation sessions. We were able to like get funding to like buy massage chairs for our gym is where we ended up placing them. It was kind of like a fun club to get involved with. And I would consider it volunteering for the community. Um, all righty. Let's see what other questions we have here.
Oh, just before I
Oh, go
forget,
ahead.
I forgot to add something when we were talking about classes. Um, so for those of you who are like planning to be STEM majors, you don't necessarily have to take like all STEM classes. I recommend sprinkling in like some fun ones to help lighten your workload and to not feel burned out. Like for example, I took this music class where the it was during COVID, so the professor he like shipped me a Renaissance guitar and I spent the whole semester learning how to play it. And then I also took like a Hollywood film class just to kind of watch and analyze films from the 1920s to 1960s. So that was also a really fun and creative outlet for me. Yeah, so for those who are in STEM, you don't need to take only STEM classes. You can take fun classes too. Um, make your college experience a lot better than if you were only to take STEM classes. And I feel like that might have helped, or that might have helped me prevent me from not burning out.
Thanks. And I think I saw an answer in the chat that said, when to take different STEM classes, orgo, biochem, physics, etc. I would kind of say exactly what you were saying, Hillary, and try to balance those harder classes with maybe something that you think will be a little easier. So maybe if you think biochem will be really hard for you, then take it with, maybe a film class that might be easier. But I would definitely talk to upperclassmen and see which classes they found easy and hard to kind of coordinate your class schedule. But I think that's probably a good way to balance it. All right. And then someone put in the Q&A, we can go ahead and answer this one out loud. How did you integrate your major into your med school application? And do you have any tips on how to bring up the interest of the major during interview season or your personal statement? Okay, that's a good one. I guess I can try to start with that one. So my major was biochem, which is a pretty typical STEM major for pre-meds. I did do some biochem related research in undergrad. So I did research on virology or viruses. So that's kind of how I integrated that. And I've always just had a passion for science and really getting down into the weeds, down into the details, which is why I did like basic science research in undergrad. So I really talked about how I love basic science and research and how I might want to do like a clinical and research career in the future. So I kind of focused, my love for science in that way. But I think it was a pretty typical pre-med course. Hillary, any insights?
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. So I majored in neuroscience and I also did neuroscience research. So I think for a lot of like a big part of my application, there were definitely a lot of questions about like, oh, what research experience did you have and what did you learn? What do you learn from it? And like, how would it help you, I guess, contribute to the medical community? So I did spend a lot of time talking about like what I contributed to in my neuroscience lab. Um, and neuroscience was also um, a big influence on me pursuing medicine. So that was also mentioned in my personal statement, like in the very beginning of it. Um, I think for other majors, it's really good to show the admissions why like you're passionate about whatever major you chose. It doesn't necessarily, again, it doesn't have to be a STEM major. Um, as long as you're able to connect the dots and like tie your activity or major into like a meaningful connection with your application, that's what matters.
Yeah, and just before I forget, I think what you're saying is really important. And we kind of keep repeating this is the fact that the best way to really sell yourself on your application is to have a cohesive story about who you are and what your interests are. So it's really good if you can kind of do some self-reflection and really think about what you want to portray on your application. So, for instance, if you're really passionate about mentoring and you know that now, it would be really good for you to get involved in some mentoring clubs, some mentoring opportunities. Or if you're really passionate about, let's say, dance as I was, it'd be really fun for you just to get involved in some different dance opportunities and maybe do some dance research. So really just do that self-reflection because it's a really important part of your application. All right. And then I'll turn it over to Ryan to answer the question about how you integrate your major into your interviews and your personal statements.
Yeah, so my perspective might be a tiny bit different from what's been discussed already, and that would be that you can make the major selection as central or non-central to your narrative as you like. I think the caveat there is if you choose a major that is off the beaten path for what many pre-meds typically go for, you might need to explain yourself at some point to an interviewer who's like, "Oh, why did you do this thing that we don't often see. So it can be good to anticipate that, but I think from the perspective of your application interview as to how you describe it, I think you can choose to make it as central or not central as you like. Um, in terms of how I did it, so my major actually didn't show up a lot in my personal statement. I think I actually talked about Tycho throughout like my entire personal statement was a very like long metaphor for Tycho and like the different elements of Tycho and how it pertains to medical research or the medical sphere. Um, so I didn't really bring that up. I think in the interviews it did come up as to like, they would say like, why did you do electrical engineering if your goal is to like, have your hands might maybe like operating on a human someday. And I think the reply there was more so I enjoyed the way that the engineering classes were taught in the sense of how it frames my mind and how I would approach problems. So kind of like using the physics or intro EE classes, the whole sort of framework was here are these like universal rules, F equals MA, VF equals VI plus AT. These are the things that you like unequivocally are true, not unequivocally. There are caveats there, of course, but these are the things that you know to be true within this sort of set of operating parameters. How do you apply it to this new situation when you are now like on the moon or, entirely different scenario? I enjoyed that problem solving aspect. And so I would describe how I think those classes benefited me in terms of really stimulating that thinking process. But I didn't really overtly choose to bring that up in, I think, either the interview or the application. So it was a little bit less central for me personally.
Thanks. All right, so I'll move on to another question. It says, do you have any advice about how to maximize your time while shadowing? And how can I make a good impression? Um, so in terms of shadowing, I think there's a lot of different things you can get out of your shadowing experience. One is just, I think it's really important to kind of understand what the setting you're shadowing in is. So, are you in a clinic? Clinics generally run faster and are a faster paced environment. Are you in the emergency medicine room where emergencies are happening and the attending physicians might not have as much time to chat with you? Or are you in a more relaxed setting? Um, because these settings really kind of dictate how much time you will be able to spend with the attendings or the residents that you're shadowing and how many questions you can ask them. Um, so it's really good just to know those social cues if, you don't want to be super annoying if the attending's really busy and kind of like asking them a bunch of questions, um, because they don't necessarily have a lot of time to answer at that point. But I think the main thing to do while you're shadowing is really just to be curious and to show them how curious you are. And that really is the best way to learn while shadowing anyway. So whenever they bring up like X-ray imaging or MRI imaging, you can just, ask if they would walk you through the different structures in the imaging, or, if you have a patient that you see that has heart failure, maybe you can just ask your attending, your resident that you're shadowing, if they can, talk to you a little bit more about the medicine of heart failure, things like that. But also, I'd recommend while you're shadowing physicians, just to ask them about their lifestyle. So, for instance, if you're shadowing an emergency med doc, you might ask them, what's your typical day in your life? And emergency med docs usually work shifts. So they may work like an 8 to, 5 p.m. shift, but they may also regularly work like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shifts. So it's really good just to, ask attendings and residents what their life looks like, because that could be your life one day too. All right, I'll ship it over to Hillary.
Yeah, I really agree with your first point. Um, as like a pre-med student, it's really important to know how to read the room and not be the person who is interfering with the patient's care. You just kind of want to stand in the back and just observe. And some physicians might like let you be more active. It just depends on who you're with. But most of the time, just to be safe, you shouldn't try to like interfere or chime in and ask questions right when the physician is talking with the patient. I usually say questions for like near the end of the patient's visit or once the patient has left the room, um, just so that the like physician be able to answer questions afterward. And then after or near the end of my shadowing shift, like for example, if I'm planning to shadow like um 2 or 3 hours that day, then near the end, I would have more time to ask the physician questions about, oh, like what made you choose this career or what made you choose a specialty? Um, and then it's also insightful to ask them whether or not they regretted their choice, or what other specialties they were considering and why they didn't choose those specialties compared to the one that they're currently in. Um, yeah, and then I also would ask about um, whether they had any issues with like I guess like the electronic record that their hospital is using, or if there are any um, I guess more logistical or administrative issues that they run into when they're working in a certain place, like in a clinic or a hospital. And I feel like a lot of the doctors that I've talked to, they do talk a lot about, oh, like it's a lot of paperwork. So like some specialties will have more paperwork than others, and I think that's it also depends on what you're interested in. Like if you're okay with doing task and paperwork, or if you'd rather do like more procedural stuff in your like main time. So that's also a good question to ask, just to know what tasks they do on a daily basis and how much time is dedicated to those tasks.
Yeah, I guess I can give some 2 cents here. So in the regard of comments on asking about if physicians regret their choices, I would posit that no physician has made it to where they are without considering that maybe they should have done something else. I think that's a common thing. Even in training, if you're in med school and you don't question your choice to enter med school, you're not doing it right. But no, I'm just kidding. Anyway, I think so for shadowing the two advice points I would want to convey. No, point number one, be proactive and anticipate. What I mean by that is it can be very easy to fall in this kind of like passive wallflower mode where you're just like shrinking into the corner of the room or walking to the side in the corridor as like patients and physicians and other healthcare providers pass, or you just kind of fade into the background. And there's some good elements to that in the sense that you're not interfering with the care that is being given. But I think what it also does is it sort of fosters this kind of just observatory role that prevents you from being able to then, engage in certain scenarios where you are allowed to engage. So simple acts of, if you know that a consent form is going to be signed and the physician needs a pen to pass to the patient and you have one, you can just pass over a pen. If you know that you're going to be going through a set of double doors ahead and the patient is in a wheelchair with their family, you can open the doors. These are the small things that are going to register as a difference. And when, the attending or your supervisor, your clinical supervisor sees you doing these things, they will also see that you're invested in the process and that you kind of are in the loop on what's the next step. One of the worst things you can do is just kind of follow along and just be this like floppy rubber ducky that's not really engaging in what's being done. So point number one is be proactive and anticipate. Point number two is, as Hillary and Nicole were describing, be very inquisitive at the right times. So what I would do is I would actually have like a little notebook in my pocket or a piece of folded paper or something, and I would only write in that notebook between patients. So I was never in the same room as a patient, like scribbling in my notebook, because what that conveys is I'm not paying attention, or maybe I think something's really intriguing or wrong, and then the patient's family might be like, "What's going on with this random kid in the corner scribbling?" So write in between patients, and then I would do that because I knew also, my attending is busy. They don't have time to answer the 4 billion questions I have about, what a craniotomy is in between their sort of 15-minute consults and whatnot. So save your questions for the opportune time, and the opportune time might not be that same day. If you reach the end of the day and all the other people monitoring you are very busy, you can save it for another day, just arrange for that type of meeting. But I think the two big points I'd really want to convey to be like, in my opinion, the best sort of shadowing student you can be. Point number one, prepare and be anticipatory. And then point number two is ask questions, be inquisitive, but at the right time.
Oh, just one more note on questions. Um, it's better to ask questions that it's not just like a simple Google search. Like you shouldn't just ask like, oh, what does hypertension mean? Because you can just Google it, save the physician some time. Instead, I usually ask questions like, oh, why did you choose to do like this treatment over this one? Or um, I mainly ask questions about the physician's choice or like their method rather than asking simple, like straightforward questions like, oh, what does, I don't know, like this disease mean? So it also depends on like what type of question you ask.
Sorry, I'll follow up with some additional things there. I totally agree with that. I think I would also recommend if you encounter a complex case on a day that you are not able to digest in that moment, physicians, and I've never run into a physician or healthcare provider who doesn't love pouring over a case the next day when they have a moment. The reason is when you come that next morning and say, hey, Dr. So and so, I was thinking about this last night, and it just doesn't quite make sense to me as to why X would then be preceded by Y, or why after seeing A, one would do B. I wanted to pick your brain on this. Here's all the work that I like Googled or searched up, and I still ran into this sort of roadblock here. When they see that you've done that whole self-initiation process, when they see that you are spending after hours time on this, they know this is someone who's invested in this profession. And, I hesitate in making this comment that next comment I'll say, which is it can come across in a rec letter because I think it promotes this illusion that you should do this thing to get a good rec letter. No, you should do this thing because you actually want to learn about it, but it can actually benefit you as well. But I would emphasize this should be coming from a place of self-curiosity and interest and passion.
Yeah, thanks, guys. All right, so we have only 8 minutes left. I wanted to open up the floor for questions. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask your question, you're feel free to do that or go ahead and drop one in the chat. I'll wait for a couple minutes. And then if we don't have anything else, I have a few more questions prepared as well. Hillary, do you have something?
Yeah, so for the question on tips for preparing for med school interviews, what I did was I went on Google and then I searched up like common medical school interview questions, and then I would get like a good gist of what type of questions they'll ask. And then I also took some time to read through my entire application again, so like my personal statement, all the secondaries, just to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. Um, since sometimes they would ask you a question about something they read in your application, and if you don't know what you wrote, then it might be you might stumble and not know how to answer. Um, Something else I did, I think I also, um, yeah, I used the questions that I found online, and then I try to think of ways that the interviewer could ask the same question but kind of make it different, and I would try to add more onto my practice answer. So I had like a Google Docs where I typed down all the practice questions and then I typed down my answers just to organize my thoughts, and then I would just review um, what I'm planning to say. But again, during your actual interview, you'll um, not memorize everything that you wrote down. You just need to know like the major ideas of what you want to say and then convey it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I totally agree. During interview season, I sort of did the same thing. I wrote out answers to specific questions online that I found that I know they would likely ask. They're likely going to ask, why do you want to go into medicine? And they can also ask, well, why not PA? Why not, nursing? So you kind of have to be able to say why you want to be a physician over those different healthcare professions as well. And then there's also other common questions to answer, like why our specific school, our specific program, are there specific, clubs that you're interested in getting involved in here? Is there a specific global health program you're really interested in here? So it's really important to research the school before the interviews as well to see if your interests align with their interests. Um, and then also in interview season, I think it's really helpful if you just think up like a few stories and have those stories kind of illustrate different traits that you want to portray about yourself. So like I just wrote down a few stories that I thought were really impactful to me during my time shadowing, in the US and also in Ghana. And those stories really helped me kind of craft an answer to any question that they could have asked me, and also helped illustrate, different traits that I wanted to get across. So I think it's really helpful to do that as well. Ryan, any thoughts?
Yeah, this could be an entire other, Medmentor Monday programming session, I think, and we have done that before, but this conversation is fantastic. Yeah, I would second everything, and maybe some additional points would be kind of along the lines of what Hillary was saying in terms of having the main ideas but not memorizing. People can very easily tell when a response is scripted, and you know, you can read it from a mile away. So I think the main way to approach that is for various questions, have some main bullet point items in terms of what you want to describe in what order, but don't memorize the exact wording as to how you're going to describe those things. It will come across much more organically and conversationally if you do that, as opposed to, memorizing. I grew up in, Albuquerque, New Mexico with my twin brother, and then it just people can see it. So that would be one point. Another point is to practice. And what I mean by practice is practice with people both in and out of the clinical sphere. The reason I think that's important is because people in the clinical sphere know what types of questions they were asked, and they can ask you the same types of questions. People outside the clinical sphere will really probe your interest. Like, why do you want to sign up for this? This is like a long time before you're making like real money, before you're getting to your final stage of your career, before you are allowed to actually treat patients on your own. Why are you doing this? Those are the people who can really hone in on those things and identify the weak links in the response or the confusing elements of the response. So I think getting that practice in early and often is also really good. Uh, Other things is just to be, genuine. It seems like a very simple piece of advice, but be genuine, conversational. Most interviews that I went into, I thought, this is going to be scary. This person is like using this as their evaluation of me as a person, as a med school applicant, et cetera, et cetera. 100% of the times it was just a person talking to another person. So these interviews are conversational generally. Very, very rarely will you find it to be a technical grilling that you might think of a usual interview to be. So I would just approach it from a sense of like, this is a conversation where I get to tell you about me and I get to hear about you.
Yeah,
I guess.
I
Oh, go ahead.
oh sorry. Yeah, I agree with that last point. I think when I started preparing for interviews, I was really nervous that it would just be like the interviewer grilling me on my research or like the very nitpicky stuff. But I think out of all my interviews, there was only one person who grilled me. The rest were they were actually kind of fun. Like we talked about like our life, and then I also was able to connect with some um physicians on what they did for fun.
Yeah, I totally agree. They also didn't grill me on the nitpicky stuff. Like I had some very basic science research down in the weeds, but nobody was asking me about the specifics. So it's really good to just know, a general overview of your research as well and be able to talk about it sort of from a broader perspective and maybe why it's important. One other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of interviews is there are a couple different styles of interviews. So the main style that we've been talking about now is the personal interview, where it's a traditional one-on-one interview, and either a med student or attending will be asking you the questions. There are a couple different other types of interviews. One of them is called an MMI or multiple mini interview. And in those interviews, you'll typically be asked like ethical questions, for instance, um, sort of out of pocket questions. So I would just, Google MMI interviews just so you're aware of those. And then there's one other style of interviews that you might encounter, which is a group interview. And those I only encountered over Zoom because COVID is when I was doing my interviews. But it was kind of like a Zoom session like this where there were multiple people in the room and they kind of broadly asked questions to the audience. So, any thoughts on those other types, guys?
Yeah, I only did MMI in personal. I didn't have any group ones. The very first station and the very first MMI I ever did, the gentleman across the table sat me down and said, "We're just here to determine that you are not a serial killer." So I think that just goes back to the point about most of these interviews are very conversational. They're not as scary and nerve-wracking as they, seem to be from afar. Everyone feels that way. So, the nerves are 100% normal. But really, these are people just trying to get a sense of like who you are, what makes you tick. So, and I guess to address the comment about workshop on interviews, so we certainly, I think, might have that on the radar. We also, I think, are hosting a mock miniature interview soon. It might already be on the sign up. So maybe check the website and take a look for that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I also only had traditional interview and the MMIs. And I feel like for the MMI, it felt like half of the questions were like ethical, what would you do in this situation question, and the other half were more standard questions like, oh, what do you think is your like biggest weakness, or what are you most proud of, um, or like what do you like to do um, for fun. So it depends on um, which school you're interviewing for and what kind of questions they ask. And I guess just to jump on to Ryan's point about like having clinical and non-clinical people ask you questions, I did something similar, but with my personal statement where I had both my pre-meds and my non-pre-med, non-STEM friends read my application or read my statement and give me like feedback because I feel like um, it helps to open up your mindset about like what is important or what sounds good in your statement. I feel like a lot of my pre-med reviewers, they were more like STEM focused. And then for my non-STEM or non-pre-med friends, um, they were able to ask or give feedback on parts where they wanted clarification, or to talk more about, oh, like how did this experience impact me, or how did it um, influence like why I want to go into medicine. So I think it's really valuable to have different mindsets and different perspectives go into your application.
The tiny add-on to that, also do that as early as possible. I think there's a tendency both for interview practice and for essays, personal statements, or secondaries to want to wait until you have it like almost fully, if not fully polished before you ever let other eyes go onto it. On the contrary, get eyes on it as soon as possible, even if you have a working draft, because I probably had way too many drafts because I decided to wait until it was polished. And then I would show it to someone, they'd be like, this doesn't make sense, or this is like too generic, or something like that. So start early.
Yeah, I agree. And then one thing to add on that too is you have your personal statement, which will go to all medical schools, and then you have the secondary essays, which will send to individual medical schools. And a lot of those secondary essays, you can almost like use secondary essays you wrote for one specific school and modify them for a different specific school. So it's not actually that overwhelming. You can reuse a lot of your essays. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Sorry, one last thing on that. Just make sure you don't, for example, tell Harvard why you want to go to Cornell. It
Yeah,
happens. So read your secondaries. Make sure that you're telling Harvard you want to go to Harvard or UCLA you want to go to UCLA.
exactly. That would be a fatal mistake. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining tonight's session. I hope this has been helpful for you all. We'll have another Med Mentors Monday in a couple of weeks, so I hope you can join then. But until then, thank you all, and thank you, Hillary and Ryan, for joining as well. All right, bye, guys.